Hello, and welcome to this keynote session on diversity and inclusion in the financial sector at the Global Borrowers and Bond Investors Forum. It's a real pleasure to be joined today by Anita Angelovska Bezhoska, the Governor of the National Bank of the Republic of North Macedonia. Welcome, Anita, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It has been really a pleasure for me.
It's really exciting today that we are talking about the important topic of diversity and inclusion. I know you've spoken about the need to improve gender diversity in central banks, and it's a laudable objective in its own right, of course, in the interest of fairness. But in what ways can it also improve the overall effectiveness of a central bank?
Okay, let me start by saying that financial world, including the central banking community, is a man-dominated world. We can refer to a couple of indexes or studies which clearly point that women are not equally represented in financial world. For example, let me refer to the OMFIF index, which clearly points that there is a long way to go to improve participation of the women in the financial world. For example, the most recent score is 30 for the commercial banks, and for the central banks is even lower. This is index which practically tracks the equal presentation of men and women in the decision-making bodies. So practically, I would say that these numbers and many other indices or indicators in this field clearly are in a way a call for action, and call for action not only on the side of the policymakers, but also on the institutions themselves, private and public institutions. And this call, it should not be only on the grounds of equal representation, fairness in the society, representing better the society, or balance per se, but I think it should be based on the grounds that higher participation of women means a lot of benefits for everybody in this society and for the overall society. Why? Because there are a lot of even empirical studies that clearly point to a link between higher representation of women in the financial institutions, especially at the decision-making bodies, and higher economic outcomes. And lower representation clearly is related to lower productivity and economic loss. Some estimates even point that in an advanced world, about 10% GDP is lower in comparison to what it can be with higher presentation, and in the advanced world, even more, about 30%. So making efforts in this segment can yield a lot of benefits for the society overall. And I think it's important to underline that higher inclusion of women will not contribute only through the channel of higher quantity of the labor force, because this is one of the key determinants of the growth, as we know. I think quality factors, as women tend to have different skills, different perspectives, some specific features such as higher maybe risk aversion, but higher thoughtfulness, maybe higher fear of failure, or maybe some higher empathy, etc. So this mixture of skills that usually women tend to have contributes to a more diversified institutional environment. This is equally relevant for the central banks. Including more women means more diversified institutional environment. And this higher diversification of the environment clearly leads us to better success. I think even there are studies that empirically confirm or correlate higher participation of women, higher diversity in general, with higher success, because this approach brings all together and means higher heterogeneity in different attitudes, values, approaches to solving problems in general. So I think diversity can have significant positive impact on the way how the central banks are doing their job, focusing more precisely on the participation of the women at the higher decision-making bodies in the central bank. I think it can clearly improve overall organizational performance of the institution. Many surveys clearly point that higher participation of women can positively affect, for example, work environment overall, interrelations between the colleagues in more friendly environment. But also on the other hand, it can strengthen control mechanism since women tend to be slightly more risk averse than men. It also positively contributes towards more participative decision-making process, as well as more focus on gender issues in the corporate management policy of the central bank. It can also serve, it can send a good signal, and it can act as a role model, especially for other women in the central bank, and thus contribute to higher productivity of the female in the central bank and overall productivity of the institution. I think what it is also important to be mentioned, it's relevant in general, but also for the central bank, that diverse teams also tend to be better teams to cope in challenging times, solve different kind of problems and adapt to changing environment. As we all know, these years we are living in a very challenging environment when conventional paradigms in the central banking community change significantly. Central banks are expected to act swiftly, are expected to innovate, experiment, and make many bold decisions that even have redistributive effects in the society, which clearly means that we are under higher scrutiny by the society, which implies also a need to strengthen the quality of the decision making, and diverse structures can add additional value. And last but not least in this segment, it's very important not to forget that in the last 10 years following the global financial crisis, central banks have been entrusted with many new responsibilities and tasks. I can mention, for example, macroprudential mandate, resolution, consumer protection, financial literacy, or financial inclusion. So it means that it has been even touching highly socially responsible areas which in principle ask for more attitude of we care, and this is the attitude which is more correlated with women.
It's interesting, those points you brought up. I know that there is this theory that in order to advance in organizations such as central banks, women are more inclined to act in a conservative way, probably more closely aligned with the conventional behavior. For example, female central bankers are said to be more likely to be hawkish with rate decisions. Do you think that's true?
Well, I will add first that even there are empirical studies, not just theory, but empirical studies that have similar conclusions that point to a higher conservatism of the woman in decision-making, maybe higher hawkishness and so on. There are also some studies in behavioral economics that more in general point to a different attitude of female economists towards the policy approach and male economists. For example, female economists tend to be more inclined to undertake some measures when solving specific measures, for example, calling more for governments or state intervention when there are financial stability issues, or promoting more environmental policy in general, or focusing on gender gap in labor market policies and so on. Speaking about the monetary policy more precisely, there are at least a couple of studies, empirical studies, that clearly indicate that higher participation of a woman in a monetary policy committees means better inflation performance, better inflation outcome. For example, one recent study that dates from 2018, but it's very comprehensive, covering about 100 central banks, clearly concludes that participation of women matters for the monetary policy. And in principle, it means higher price stability. De facto, for the same inflation rate, higher participation of women means higher interest rate. How it can be interpreted? From the one way, yes, it points to some hawkishness or some higher readiness to fight the inflation, to preserve the price stability, but it can also mean lower exposure to pressures or higher resistance to pressure from politics to maintain, or having in mind the trade-off between the inflation and the overall economic outlook. So I think in my experience, I'm surrounded by the team dominated by women. I must mention, we as a central bank are a good example for gender balance, or maybe somebody can interpret it in a different way, because in our situation, in our central bank, women in the total number of employees account for about 60% roughly, and at the management or decision-making levels, even more, close to 70%. So clearly, this is environment dominated by women. On top of governor, also 2 vice governors out of 3 are women. And my experience is very positive. Yes, I can say that women may have a lower level of tolerance for risk, but they're very prudent, very thorough. And on the other hand, they are also very thoughtfulness and full of empathy. So I must say, I really enjoy having such team.
How do you see yourself lining up compared to your peers? Do you think of yourself as more hawkish or more conservative?
Well, it's difficult to assess myself. It's a difficult question. Maybe my colleagues can better answer how they perceive me, whether I am more hawkish, but maybe I am. Maybe I am. Yes, I am type of a person that is really very thorough. Maybe I have lower tolerance for risk. But anyway, I think what is very important that all the decisions that are made by the central bank are inclusive decisions. Many people are on board when we discuss, when we have brainstorming, and of course the purpose is to have really decision that is well informed and takes on board many different aspects and perspectives.
That inclusivity is something I wanted to touch on as well. With financial inclusion, economic decisions, owning bank accounts, financial literacy, it's often generally seen higher in countries among men than among women. And of course, the main job of the central bank is to set monetary policy. So what can you do to encourage a more balanced access to finance?
Mm-hmm. Yes, financial inclusion is a very important aspect, and I think we all well know that financial inclusion is one of the determinant of better growth prospects for each society. However, the most recent data are not very much encouraging, as you mentioned. Maybe despite some progress over the years, still, there is significant gap in terms of inclusion of women or access of women to the finances. Women still remain underbanked in comparison to men. For example, about 72% of men have accounts in the banks, and about 65% of women accounts in a bank. So there is this clearly 7 percentage points gap. Also about 38% of women account from the total outstanding loans. I'm speaking in global terms, these are averages in global terms, but also women tend to be less present at the capital market, so tend less to manage the household finances. Overall, it shows that on this front, we have many things to do. There is a vast room for improvement. North Macedonia is not exception. The situation is similar. Well, maybe the access to accounts is somewhat higher in our economy, but still the share of women in the total outstanding loans is not satisfactory. It's almost the same as the global average, about 38%. Nevertheless, now the question is what a central bank can do, because this is a complex question which requires a holistic approach from many policymakers in the society. Nevertheless, I think there are two segments which I would like to shed some light, where I think that the central banks can undertake some steps. First segment is regulation in the financial system, a regulation that will be conducive to proliferation of new services and products, services that are less expensive so that a higher proportion of the households can afford them, services that are more tailored to the customers, which can also help in closing the financial access gap that is evident. We as a central bank are undertaking a lot of activities in this segment. Now we are in the process of finalizing the new payment services law, which will bring higher competition, new entrants on the market, a higher choice of new financial products, especially fintech products, but also this new regulation has a lot of provisions that are focused on protection of consumers and increasing the transparency. A second important aspect, which I think is also closely related to the first one, is financial education, because fintech or higher access to such, let's say, new products also is closely related to adequate information and knowing about these new products. So I think we as a central banks have to undertake a lot of measures. There is one recent study of the OECD which assesses the level of financial education of women and men. I mean, it's overall assess of the household, but there is also this gender perspective, which clearly shows that there is a gap. In this, and especially for more digitally based financial products. So in this context, there is also one study from the BIS, recent study from the BIS published this year, which points to a significant fintech gender gap. That is, it is pointing to a striking difference between digital active women and digital active men. For example, about 30% of men have used fintech services, and about 20% from women. We as a central bank are also undertaking a lot of activities in this segment of financial education. De facto, the new strategic plan of the central bank for the first time includes a strategic objective of financial education and financial inclusion. And in this context, we are in the process of finalizing the first national strategy on financial inclusion and financial education, which very importantly have also into account the gender perspective.
What triggered that? What made this priority of education and financial inclusion part of your agenda?
Well, we are aware, first of all, I think all the central banks have learned the lessons from the global financial crisis, when, of course, financial education was not the main trigger of the financial crisis, but it became even more clear that managing well the risks, financial education is very important. And it is a trend that started following the global financial crisis. All the central banks have started putting more emphasis. We are part of this story as well. We have started organizing many activities in this segment for disadvantaged groups, for groups. First of all, we also started screening to see what's the level of financial education. Before that, we didn't have even a stock taking, what's the level. Now, when we already have analysis done, surveys done, we have a good basis, and then we continue almost on a yearly basis to monitor and evaluate the progress in this segment, and accordingly to adjust our financial education activity to reach the goal of higher financial education, because financial education goes hand in hand with financial inclusion, and financial inclusion is a key determinant for economic potential of the economies.
I would be remiss if I did not bring up COVID, of course, today. So how has working from home affected the opportunities for women in the National Bank of North Macedonia? As the pandemic hopefully declines and normality returns, what will your approach to work from home and flexibility be? And what additional safeguards are needed to make it work?
Let me first mention that the pandemic shock that we all faced created a huge challenges also from the organizational point of view, from the central banks. Even I can say it, our workplace turned upside down, at least at the first stage of the corona crisis. Women in particular have been negatively affected, because in a way, the crisis even more emphasized the challenges that the women have been facing even before the crisis. For example, working mothers have always worked double shift. But now on top of this comes interruption in the education, in the childcare, which implies that now women have to additionally provide and have a lot more activities in the segment of schooling, childcare, increased housework, and so on. So then it means that no wonder why the recent McKinsey study points that one woman in four tend to downshift their work or even leave their work. And the most often stated factors for this is feeling that they have to be always on in a way, constantly being at the job, whether be it at home or at office. Then also increased caregiving burden that they are faced, and also the feeling that they will be worse judged because of the now increased responsibilities in this segment. So we as other central banks had to adjust to this new environment. And how we adjust, first of all, we provided more flexible working arrangements, which was necessary. What were these more flexible arrangements? Work from home or remote work, then more flexible working hours. And when we compare with experiences from other central banks, I think our experience is similar in terms of the measures that we have undertaken. For example, there is one study that points that almost all central banks have introduced a flexible work from home. About 2/3 of the central bank introduced flexible working hours, and half of the central banks have introduced part-time work. So how has it worked? In general, I think we have managed to cope well with the new challenges. These new arrangements have worked well, I can say in general. We managed to, of course, preserve the health, well-being of our employees, and in the same time to maintain all our functions and preserve the macroeconomic stability in this challenging time. Concerning the work from home, it's also important that our employees are happy with this, and they show even readiness that in post-COVID crisis they continue to work at least some time of the working time from home, which in a way have stimulated a lot of discussions within our organization and maybe some rethinking of our previous approach towards work from home. So we are doing some analysis, and we will see how and to what extent we will change the regular activities of the central bank. But we are first of all looking forward to see more positive prospects in the Corona segment, and then we will make some strategic decisions in this direction.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Anita. This has been a pleasure talking to you this morning, and I feel like I've learned a lot about central banks and about diversity and inclusion.
Thank you very much, and it was really a pleasure for me.
Thank you also to our audience for watching today. Please do also check out our new inclusivity agenda website on the Euromoney Conferences homepage. The next session in the agenda will follow shortly.